In the shivering dawn of March 1982, a cold, relentless wind was scouring the flat reaches of Seward County, Nebraska. This was the heart of the American breadbasket, a place where the soil was supposed to be a man's bank account and the horizon was his only limit. But that spring, the atmosphere felt heavy with more than just the coming rain. It was thick with the ghost of a philosophy that had dominated the Great Plains for a decade, a mantra championed by the former Secretary of Agriculture, Earl Butz: get big or get out. For years, the federal government and the big banks had whispered into the ears of every farmer from Ohio to the Rockies, telling them to plant fence to fence, to leverage their land, and to treat the earth like a factory that never needed to sleep. Silas Thorne, a 55-year-old man with hands like cured leather and eyes the color of a winter sky, stood on the edge of his 320 acres and watched the world go by. To his left and right, his neighbors were already out in their fields. The air hummed with the guttural roar of high-horsepower diesel engines, the kind of shiny, green and yellow iron that cost more than a man's first 3 houses combined. He could smell the acrid, metallic tang of anhydrous ammonia being injected into the dirt, a chemical promise of yields that was supposed to justify the staggering debt every man in the county was carrying. In 1981, the prime interest rate had screamed up to 21.5%, and the cost of an operating loan was enough to make a strong man's knees buckle. Most of Seward County was sprinting on a treadmill that was moving faster than they could run, buying more land at $3,000 an acre just to pay for the equipment they used to farm the land they already owned. It was a cycle of expansion fueled by credit and chemicals, and to everyone else, it looked like progress. But that morning, Silas Thorne decided he was done running. It started at the local equipment dealership, a place that usually hummed with the excitement of new sales and the smell of fresh grease. When Silas walked in and asked to speak with the manager about selling back his late-model John Deere 4440, a machine he'd only owned for 3 years, the room went silent. The dealer, a man who had built his retirement on the commissions from those very machines, looked at Silas like he'd just asked for directions to the moon. "You want to sell the 4440, Silas?" the dealer asked, leaning over a counter polished by the elbows of 1,000 hopeful farmers. "You can't work 300 acres without that kind of power. You'll be behind before the first seed hits the ground. What are you going to use instead?" "A garden hoe." Silas didn't blink. "I'm going back to basics," he said, his voice as steady as a heartbeat. "And I'm returning the 3,000 gallons of fertilizer I ordered last fall. I don't want the debt, and the land doesn't want the poison." Word traveled through a small farming town faster than a prairie fire in a drought. By noon, the men at the feed store were already laughing. They talked about how Silas Thorne had finally let the Nebraska sun get to his brain. But the laughter turned to genuine bewilderment when Silas showed up at a small livestock auction 2 counties over. He wasn't looking for high-production Holstein cows or prize-winning hogs. He was looking for draft horses. He came home with 4 massive Percherons, thick-necked, heavy-limbed beasts that looked like they belonged in a museum or a history book rather than a modern Nebraska farm. He spent the next 3 weeks driving an old Ford pickup with 200,000 miles on it from one neighboring ranch to another. But he wasn't looking to buy land. He was looking for what everyone else called trash. He spent his days hauling mountains of spoiled hay, old wheat straw, and every ton of aged manure he could get his hands on for the price of hauling it away. His neighbors, sitting in their air-conditioned tractor cabs with AM radios playing the latest country hits, would slow down as they passed the Thorne place. They watched in disbelief as Silas and his team of horses moved across the fields, not pulling a heavy moldboard plow to turn the black earth over into neat, naked ribbons, but instead spreading layers of brown organic matter across the surface. "What in the hell are you doing, Silas?" Roy Miller shouted over the fence one afternoon, his massive 4-wheel drive tractor idling with a low, expensive throb. Roy was 32, aggressive, and buried $300,000 deep in bank loans. "You're supposed to be tilling. You're supposed to be opening that ground up so it can breathe. You're just piling garbage on top of your profit." Silas stopped the horses, wiped the dust from his forehead with a blue bandana, and looked at the ground. "The land is tired, Roy," Silas called back. "It's been mined for 10 years to pay for those machines you're sitting in. I'm not going to cut it open anymore. I'm putting it to bed. From now on, this soil is going to sleep under a blanket." Roy just shook his head and engaged the transmission, sending a plume of black diesel smoke into the air that drifted across Silas's field like a dark omen. To Roy and the rest of Seward County, Silas wasn't just making a mistake, he was committing a professional heresy. In an era of bigger is better, Silas Thorne was intentionally becoming small. He was walking away from the gold of the wheat and corn markets and choosing instead to invest in the rubbish of the past. As the sun set on that final day of March, Silas sat on the porch of his farmhouse and watched his horses graze in the twilight. The modern world was screaming all around him, a cacophony of interest rates, chemical dependencies, and the relentless pressure to expand or die. But on his 320 acres, there was a new, strange silence. The machinery was gone. The debt was being liquidated. And beneath the layers of straw and manure he had spent weeks spreading, the earth was waiting. Silas Thorne was no longer a modern farmer. He was a man who had decided that the only way to survive the coming storm was to stop fighting the land and start listening to it. He was a caveman in the age of the space shuttle, and as far as the county was concerned, he was already a ghost. The rain that night in April 1982 was a cold, weeping drizzle that seemed to seep into the very bones of the Nebraska landscape. Silas Thorne sat in the small, wood-paneled study of the farmhouse his grandfather had built before the turn of the century. The air smelled of old paper and wood smoke, while his neighbors were huddled over calculators, staring in horror at the skyrocketing interest rates that had climbed toward 21.5%. Silas was looking at something much older. Resting on his lap was a leather-bound journal, its edges frayed and its pages yellowed to the color of dried corn husks. It had belonged to his father, Elias Thorne, and it was a chronicle of survival from a time when the world had truly ended for the American farmer, 1934. Silas ran a rough finger over the handwriting. It was a disciplined, tight script, written by a man who didn't waste words any more than he wasted seed. Elias had lived through the Dust Bowl, an apocalyptic era where drought, wind, and poor farming practices had combined to create the worst environmental disaster in American history. As Silas read, he could almost hear his father's voice echoing through the decades. The journal described the 1930s as a period where the topsoil, the precious, thin layer of earth that made civilization possible, simply blew away, leaving behind nothing but hard pan and despair. Elias had watched his neighbors pack their meager belongings into Ford Model Ts and head for California, fleeing a sky that had turned black with the very dirt they had once owned. But Elias had stayed. He had stayed because he had noticed something that everyone else, in their rush to plow more and earn more, had forgotten. The earth has a skin, his father had written in June of 1934. When you strip that skin away with the plow, the earth bleeds its moisture into the wind. A naked field is a dead field, but under the buffalo grass, under the weeds, the dirt stays cool. The moisture hides where the sun cannot find it. Silas leaned back, the fire in the grate casting long, flickering shadows against the wall. His father had spent that terrible decade experimenting with what the neighbors then called trash farming. He had stopped plowing the hillsides, instead leaving the stalks of the previous year's crop to rot in place. He had hauled manure and straw to cover the bare spots, creating a primitive version of what modern scientists would eventually call mulch. The journal ended with a warning that felt like a cold hand on Silas's shoulder. The drought will come again, it always does. Maybe not this year, maybe not this decade, but it will come. When it does, remember what I learned. Prepare before the drought comes, not after. After is too late. To Silas, sitting there in the early 1980s, the drought was already here, though it wasn't yet made of dust. It was a drought of capital. The great expansion of the 1970s had been a fever dream. Export markets had boomed, land prices had tripled, and the government had told every farmer to expand, borrow, and buy. But then the music had stopped. President Carter had imposed the grain embargo against the Soviet Union in 1980, and export markets had collapsed almost overnight. Corn prices were falling toward $2 a bushel, while the interest on a tractor loan was heading toward 18%. Silas realized that his neighbors were being bled dry by two different parasites. The first was the bank, which demanded more interest than the land could ever produce. The second was the chemical companies. For 10 years, the county had been addicted to anhydrous ammonia and synthetic fertilizers. These chemicals acted like a drug. They gave the plants a quick burst of growth, but they did nothing for the soil. In fact, they killed the microbial life, the mycorrhizal networks and the earthworms that his father had described as the engine of the earth. "I've been mining my own land," Silas whispered to the empty room. He looked at the soil maps of Seward County, remembering the dead ground that people like Walter Gunderson had bought for $185 an acre, because no one believed it could grow a single ear of corn. He thought about how those dead fields were often just tired, stripped of their organic matter by a century of relentless plowing. His plan began to solidify, rooted in the ancient wisdom of his father's journal and the harsh reality of the 1982 economy. He wouldn't just be a farmer, he would be a strategist, much like Earl Womack, the man who had kept his tractors hidden in a barn for 30 years while he worked with mules, waiting for the day when the oil supply lines would finally break. Silas knew that a tractor ran on oil, and oil came from thousands of miles away, controlled by men in suits who didn't care if a Nebraska farmer lived or died. But a horse ran on hay and oats grown on the very land it worked, and a field covered in trash, straw, manure, and old stalks held moisture like a sponge, protecting the soil from the wind and the sun. He picked up a pen and began to write in the back of his father's journal, starting a new chapter for a new generation. 1982, he wrote. The neighbors are buying horsepower. I am buying time. They are feeding the banks. I am feeding the worms. They believe the machine is the answer. I believe the answer is beneath my boots. He understood that he was about to be the most ridiculed man in the county. He was rejecting the John Deere 4440, the shiny symbol of success, and replacing it with the ancient rhythm of the Percherons. He was walking away from the get big or get out philosophy and choosing to stay small, stay debt-free, and stay alive. The bank could not foreclose on a man who didn't owe them a cent. The chemical companies could not bankrupt a man who made his own fertility from the waste of his neighbor's livestock. Silas felt a strange sense of peace wash over him. He was no longer part of the frantic, debt-fueled race to the horizon. He was a man with a secret, a man who understood that the real wealth of a farm wasn't in the grain elevator or the machinery shed. It was in the dark, cool, living soil that slept beneath the cover. As the rain continued to drum against the roof, Silas Thorne closed the journal. He knew the drought was coming, the real one, the one made of heat and cloudless skies. And when it arrived, he would be ready. He wouldn't be the man with the biggest tractor. He would be the only man with a crop. He would be the caveman who survived when the modern world finally ran out of gas. By the summer of 1982, the mockery had moved from the corners of the feed store to the center of every conversation in Seward County. Silas Thorne was no longer just a man with a strange idea. He was the town eccentric, a living punchline they called Silas Caveman. Every time he led his team of Percherons onto the field, the modern world seemed to stop and point its finger. The sight of a man working with animal power in the age of the space shuttle was, as the local machinery dealer put it, an embarrassment to the profession. Phil Kramer, who had once sold the shiny iron that now sat in Silas's neighbors' sheds, was the loudest of the critics. He would hold court at the diner, his gold watch catching the light as he gestured toward the window. Buying dead ground or working like a Neanderthal doesn't make you a visionary. It makes you a relic, he would say, his voice dripping with the confidence of a man who still believed the high-interest expansion of the 1970s would return any day. The other farmers would laugh, their bellies full of coffee, and the uneasy bravado of men who were quietly terrified of their own bank statements. Out on the fence lines, the scorn was more direct. Roy Miller and the other young high rollers would drive their massive four-wheel drive tractors past Silas's boundary, intentionally downshifting to send plumes of black, acrid diesel smoke billowing across his horses. They'd lean out of their air-conditioned cabs and shout over the roar of their engines. "Hey, Silas, you waiting for a miracle from that pile of trash? You're going to harvest nothing but weeds and regret this year." Silas never shouted back. He would simply steady the horses, feeling the vibration of the heavy engines through the soles of his boots, and keep his eyes on the ground. He knew what they called his fields, the trash pile. While his neighbors spent thousands of dollars on herbicides to ensure not a single blade of grass or a stray weed broke the perfect, naked symmetry of their black dirt, Silas's land looked like a chaotic brown carpet. He had spread mountains of spoiled hay, wheat straw, and manure until the soil was completely hidden. To the conventional eye, it was a mess. They didn't see the science of the caveman creed. They didn't understand that beneath that layer of organic trash, a biological revolution was taking place. Silas would often kneel in the dirt, hidden from the road, and pull back the mulch, while the neighbor's bare soil was baking under the fierce Nebraska sun, turning into a hard, cracked crust that could practically fry an egg. The dirt under Silas's mulch was cool, dark, and damp. He began to see the earthworms return the engine of the earth his father had written about. In 1981, he could barely find 2 worms in a spadeful of dirt. By the spring of 1983, he was counting over a dozen. He saw the fungal networks, the tiny white threads of mycelium, weaving the soil together into a living sponge. He was feeding the soil, while his neighbors were only feeding the plants with expensive chemicals that killed the very biology the land needed to survive. The economic pressure in the county was reaching a breaking point. By 1984, the prime interest rate was still a crushing burden, and corn prices had slumped to $2.22 a bushel. Roy Miller and the others were caught in a lethal vice. They were paying 18% interest on machines they needed to farm land that was no longer profitable. They were mining their topsoil to pay the bank, pushing the land harder and harder, unaware that they were destroying the very capital they were trying to save. At the grain elevator, the tension was thick enough to taste. Farmers would avoid eye contact, their faces etched with the hollow look of men watching their lives collapse. But they still found the energy to mock Silas. When he brought in his modest harvest delivered in an old truck rather than a shiny new semi, they would snicker at the caveman's numbers. His yields weren't record-breaking. In 1983, he brought in 134 bushels of corn per acre, when the county average was 128. "See," Phil Kramer would say, leaning against the elevator scale, "all that work with horses and trash, and he's barely beating the average. What a waste of time." But Silas was doing a different kind of math. The neighbors had spent $300 an acre on fuel, synthetic nitrogen, and equipment payments. Silas had spent almost nothing. His horses ate his own oats, his fertilizer came from the trash his neighbors threw away, and his machines had been paid for in cash 40 years ago. While Roy Miller needed corn to be $4 a bushel just to break even, Silas was making a profit at $2. He was the only man in Seward County who wasn't afraid of the mailman. Every month, the bank sent out acceleration notices to his neighbors, demanding full repayment of loans they couldn't cover. Silas, however, would sit on his porch in the evenings, listening to the silence of his debt-free acres. He would watch the wind whip across the bare, clean fields of his neighbors, carrying away a fine mist of black dust, their future blowing toward the next state. He knew they thought he was crazy for letting his land look like a junkyard of straw and stalks. He knew they laughed at the caveman and his ancient horses. But as the summer of 1984 faded into the most ominous autumn the Midwest had seen in decades, Silas felt a familiar shiver. The air was getting drier. The birds were moving differently. The ghost in his father's journal was starting to stir. "The drought always comes back," he whispered to the Percherons as he unhitched them one evening. "And when it does, the men with the biggest machines will be the first to find out that you can't eat iron and you can't plant a crop in a bank statement." Silas Thorne was ready. He had built his moat out of mulch and his castle out of patience. The season of scorn was ending, and the season of the reckoning was about to begin. The summer of 1985 descended upon Seward County, Nebraska, not with a whisper, but with the roar of a furnace. By June, the sky had turned a hard, polished blue that offered no promise of rain, and the wind had become a steady, relentless current of fire that stripped the moisture from everything it touched. It was the worst drought the Midwest had seen in 20 years, a brutal echo of the 1930s that Silas's father had documented in his journal. But this time, the environmental catastrophe was paired with a man-made one. The great American farm crisis was reaching its absolute, agonizing peak. The economic vice that had been tightening for years finally snapped shut. Interest rates on operating loans had plateaued at a staggering 18%, a number that turned every seed and every gallon of diesel into a high-stakes gamble. Across the county, land values, the collateral that held up every dream of expansion, were in freefall, eventually dropping 63% from their 1981 peak. Farmers who had been told to get big or get out were finding that the exit was the only thing left for them. At the diner in town, the laughter had long since died. The men who had mocked Silas Caveman now sat in a silence so thick it was hard to breathe. They were watching their fields, the ones they had plowed so meticulously to keep clean and modern, turn into a landscape of death. Without the native grass or any organic cover, the naked black soil was baking into a hard, cracked crust that looked like shattered concrete. When the wind picked up, the precious topsoil, the layer that took nature 500 years to build, was lifted into the air and carried away in brown clouds. Roy Miller's corn was the first to show the strain. By early July, the plants were stunted, their leaves rolling into tight, defensive spikes by noon to prevent total dehydration. Roy had spent thousands of dollars on high-nitrogen fertilizers, but without water, the chemicals sat uselessly on the surface, or, worse, burned the already stressed roots. The heads of his wheat were shriveled and empty, and the stalks were falling over, too weak to stand in the heat. He was watching his $300,000 in bank debt wither away in the sun. But on the other side of the fence, the Thorn farm looked like a glitch in the reality of 1985. Silas's fields were not clean. They were still buried under the brown, chaotic carpet of mulch, the spoiled hay, the straw, and the manure that he had been spreading for 3 years. To a passerby, it still looked like a trash pile, but to the soil, it was a sanctuary. Silas would walk out into his fields in the heat of the afternoon and kneel down. While the temperature on the surface of Roy's bare soil reached over 100 degrees, the dirt under Silas's mulch remained cool and moist. The science was simple, though the county had called it medieval. The layer of organic matter acted as a physical barrier against evaporation. It was a biological sponge that had absorbed the sparse spring rains and held them in the root zone. More than that, the deep root channels created by the clover and the active earthworm population allowed the corn roots to penetrate deep into the subsoil, reaching moisture that the neighbors' shallow, chemical-dependent plants could never find. "It's happening," Silas whispered, standing in the middle of a stand of corn that was still a deep, resilient green. Just like the journal said, by August, the visual contrast between the farms was undeniable. From the county road, you could see a literal line of life and death. To the north and south, the fields were a brittle, dusty tan, the crops aborted by the heat. In the center, Silas's 320 acres stood as an oasis of green. He wasn't growing a record-breaking crop, the drought was too deep for that, but he was growing a crop which was more than anyone else could say. The realization began to ripple through the county like a slow-moving wave. Phil Kramer, the former machinery dealer who was now watching his own world collapse, drove out to the Thorn place one afternoon. He didn't stop to mock. He didn't even get out of his truck. He just sat on the shoulder of the road and stared at the green corn. He was looking at 40 years of progress being outperformed by a man with a team of horses and a pile of manure. The federal government was starting to notice, too. The Soil Conservation Service sent a field officer to Seward County to document the devastation. When he reached Silas's farm, he stopped his government sedan and took out a thermometer and a soil probe. He measured the wind speed on the windward side of Silas's boundary and then moved behind the windbreak of trees and the thick cover of the fields. He found that Silas's trash farming had reduced soil movement to almost zero, while the neighboring farms were losing 2 tons of topsoil per acre per year. But the most brutal reckoning wasn't environmental, it was financial. In the fall of 1985, the harvest numbers began to come in. The county's wheat and corn crops were down 60%. The grain elevators, which usually hummed with activity, were half empty, and the silence was haunted by the ghosts of farms that were being repossessed by the banks. Silas drove his old truck onto the elevator scale with a load of corn that yielded 134 bushels per acre. In a normal year, that would have been average. In 1985, it was a miracle. Because the hay and grain crops had failed everywhere else, the prices were climbing. Silas was selling into a desperate market, and because he had no fuel costs, no chemical bills, and no 18% interest payments, every cent of that harvest was his to keep. Roy Miller, meanwhile, had nothing to harvest. His fields were nothing but stubble and dust, and the bank was no longer interested in hearing about next year. The John Deere 4440 that had been the pride of the Miller farm was repossessed in October, sitting on a lot with dozens of other shiny, silent machines that nobody could afford to buy. One evening, Silas found Roy standing at the fence line, looking at the dark, deep soil of the Thorn place. Roy looked like a man who had aged 10 years in a single summer. "I did everything the experts told me, Silas," Roy said, his voice thick with a mixture of bitterness and wonder. "I got big. I bought the iron. I used the chemicals, and I'm losing the land my grandfather homesteaded. How did you know to do the opposite?" Silas reached into his pocket and felt the worn leather of his father's journal. "I didn't know, Roy," Silas said quietly. "I just listened to a man who had already paid for the knowledge with his own sweat and tears. I figured he'd already made the mistake so I wouldn't have to." The drought of 1985 was the final proof. It showed that the modern way of farming was a fragile system built on debt and thin air. Silas Thorn had been called a fool for 4 years, but as the dust settled over Seward County, it was clear that the Caveman was the only one who had built his house on a rock, and that rock was the living, breathing soil that he had refused to betray. By the winter of 1985, the landscape of Seward County had been fundamentally altered, not just by the heat, but by the cold reality of the ledger. The town square, which had once been the vibrant center of the farming community, now felt like a funeral parlor for a dying way of life. The auction signs were everywhere, stuck into the frozen ground of farms that had been in families for 3 generations, announcing the liquidation of dreams to satisfy the 18% interest of the banks. On a grey Tuesday morning, Silas Thorne drove his old Ford pickup to the county courthouse. He wasn't there to watch the tragedy. He was there to fulfill a promise made to the land decades before. The auction was for the Roy Miller place, the 400 acres that bordered the Thorne farm to the west. Roy was gone, moved to town to work in a warehouse, his spirit broken by the debt that had promised him the world and left him with nothing but a repossessed tractor. The bank officer, a man in a stiff suit who looked as though he had never stepped foot in a muddy field, stood on the courthouse steps. He expected the land to go to a corporate holding company from Omaha for pennies on the dollar, as few local farmers had enough capital to buy a cup of coffee, let alone 400 acres. When Silas Thorne raised his hand, a murmur went through the crowd of desperate men. "Cash," Silas said, his voice cutting through the wind like a sharpened blade. He didn't pull out a fancy checkbook or a line of credit from a national lender. Instead, he pulled a worn leather bag from the pocket of his Carhartt jacket. Inside was the physical manifestation of 4 years of patience, of trash farming, and of living without the shiny green iron that everyone else had worshipped. It was the money he had saved by not buying synthetic nitrogen, the money he had kept by using horses instead of diesel, and the profit he had made when he was the only man in the county with a crop in the middle of a drought. "I'm paying a fair price," Silas told the banker, "more than your auction will bring, because I know what this land is worth when it's treated right." He bought the Miller place that day, and 6 months later, he bought the old Watkins farm to the north. He didn't do it to build an empire or to gloat over his neighbor's despair. He did it because he knew that if he didn't save that soil, it would be mined by corporate interests until it was truly dead ground. As the 1980s faded into the 90s, Silas Thorne became more than a farmer. He became a teacher. The mockery had long since vanished, replaced by a quiet, desperate hunger for the knowledge he possessed. Farmers who had once laughed at Silas Caveman now found themselves sitting at his kitchen table, drinking black coffee and looking at the yellowed pages of his father's journal. He showed them how to stack the mulch, how to read the skin of the earth, and how to trust the biology of the soil over the chemistry of a bag. He told them the story of the 3 sisters, the corn, the beans, and the squash, and how the ancient ways were often the only ways that survived when the modern world ran out of fuel or credit. The years were kind to Silas, though he never stopped working the land. By the turn of the century, the Thorne farm had grown to over 800 acres, every inch of it covered in the dark, rich, organic matter that he had once been ridiculed for. The earthworms had returned in their millions, and the soil was so deep and resilient that it could absorb a 3-inch rain in a single afternoon without a drop of runoff. On a golden afternoon in September 2001, Silas Thorne stood on the highest ridge of his property with his 10-year-old grandson, Michael. Silas was 74 now, his back a little more bent, but his hands were still strong. He reached down and scooped up a handful of earth from beneath a layer of clover and wheat straw. "Look at that, Michael," Silas said, holding the soil out. It wasn't the grey, dusty sand found on the industrial farms miles away. It was black, crumbly, and smelled like the very beginning of the world. "This is the only bank account that never goes bankrupt." Silas pulled the leather-bound journal from his pocket, the one that had traveled from his father Elias to him. He handed it to the boy with a solemnity that made the child stand a little taller. "The world will try to tell you that you need to be faster, bigger, and louder," Silas said, his eyes scanning the horizon where the dark green corn met the Nebraska sky. "They'll tell you that the old ways are dead, and that you're a fool for listening to a man who's been in the ground for 50 years. But remember this, the drought always comes back, the banks always fail, the machines always rust." He pointed to the dark soil in the boy's hand. "But if you take care of the land will take care of you. Don't listen to the noise of the engines. Listen to the soil breathe. Have the courage to be the wrong kind of farmer when the right kind is going off a cliff." Silas Thorne died that following winter, but he wasn't buried in just any ground. He was laid to rest in the rich, living earth of the family cemetery behind the farmhouse, next to his father Elias and the horses that had helped him save the farm. His funeral was the largest in Seward County history, attended by men who owed their survival to a trash pile and a caveman's stubbornness. Today, Michael Thorne runs the 800 acres. He uses a modern tractor when the job requires it, but he never moves a wheel across the field without checking the journal first. And every spring, when the young farmers in town talk about the latest chemicals and the newest debt-fueled equipment, Michael just smiles and keeps spreading the mulch. He knows the secret that his grandfather paid for in sweat and patience, that the man who controls his own supplies and honors the ancient soil is the only man who truly owns his fate. The caveman's reckoning had come and gone, and what remained was the greenest, deepest, and most enduring legacy in the state of Nebraska.